Let me tell you something. There are moments in your life that split everything into a before and after. A moment where you can look back and say, that was the day everything changed. And for me, that moment happened on a Tuesday evening in October at a restaurant I had been going to since I was a little girl, surrounded by people I had loved my entire life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because if I start there, you won't understand the full weight of it. You won't feel what I felt when I heard those words. So let me take you all the way back to the beginning, when everything was still warm and good and felt like exactly the life I was supposed to have. Hello, dear friends. Thank you so much for pressing play and spending this time with me. I'm still building this little corner of the internet, and honestly, every like, every subscribe, every kind comment feels like a warm hug. If you're enjoying the story so far, I'd be so grateful if you'd tap that like button and subscribe. It really helps these quiet justice tales reach more people who need them. Also, I love reading your messages. Tell me in the comments, what city or country are you tuning in from today? It makes my day every time. Okay, let's go back to the story. I grew up in a town called Millhaven. It's one of those mid-sized towns in the Midwest where everybody kind of knows everybody, where the same families have been running the same businesses for 3 generations, and where Sunday dinners are practically a religious event. My family was the Hargroves, and for most of my childhood, being a Hargrove meant something. It meant warmth, it meant loyalty, it meant showing up. My mother, Patricia, everyone called her Pat, was the kind of woman who remembered every single birthday in the extended family without a calendar. She baked from scratch, she kept a clean house, she was always the first to show up when someone was sick and the last to leave when someone needed help. And she raised 4 of us kids with that same mentality. You take care of your people, full stop. My dad, Robert, was a quieter presence. He worked in insurance for 30 years, drove the same truck for 12 of those years, and spent his weekends in the garden. He wasn't a big talker, but he had a way of just making you feel safe, like nothing bad could really happen as long as he was around. I adored him. Then there was my sister Linda, who was 4 years older than me, and my brothers, Dennis, who was 2 years older, and little Thomas, who came along 6 years after me and was basically the family baby forever. We weren't a perfect family by any stretch. There were arguments, there were slammed doors, there were years when money was tighter than anyone wanted to admit. But the foundation of us, the core of what we were, felt solid, felt real, felt like something you could build a life on. I'm the second youngest. My name is Carol. And for a long, long time, I believed I was lucky to be born into the Hargrove family. Growing up, Linda and I were close in the way older and younger sisters sometimes are. She taught me how to do my hair. She snuck me my first sip of wine at Christmas when I was 16. She was the first person I called when I had my heart broken by a boy named Jason Fisher junior year of high school. She was dramatic, sure, a little bossy sometimes, but I always put that down to birth order. She was the oldest daughter. That came with certain responsibilities, certain expectations, and a certain tendency to think she was in charge of everything. I thought it was kind of endearing, honestly. I thought it was just Linda. After high school, Linda got married young to a man named Gary who worked in construction and had strong opinions about football and not much else. They had 2 kids, moved into a house about 10 minutes from our parents, and Linda essentially became the unofficial family coordinator. She planned every holiday gathering, organized every birthday dinner, kept the group text going, and she was good at it. I genuinely thought she was good at it. I took a different path. I went to school for accounting, moved to a bigger city about 90 miles away called Fairview, built a career at a mid-size accounting firm, eventually became a senior accountant, and made a pretty good life for myself. I bought a condo, I had a solid group of friends, I dated here and there, I came home for holidays, and I always looked forward to it. Always. Every single Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, I was there. Every kid's birthday party, every school play, every graduation. I drove that 90 miles back and forth probably 100 times over the years, and I never once complained about it because I genuinely wanted to be there. I genuinely loved those people. And my parents, they were getting older, slowly, the way parents do. By the time I was in my early 70s, my dad had retired, my mom's knees were giving her trouble, and they were in that quiet, slower phase of life, where the big moments matter even more because you know there are fewer ahead. I was aware of that. I made a point of calling them every Sunday, every single Sunday for years, sometimes twice a week. We'd talk about nothing important, the garden, what they watched on TV, how my nephew's soccer season was going. I just wanted them to know I was there. I wanted them to know they weren't forgotten just because I didn't live around the corner. I want you to hold on to that. I want you to remember that because it's going to matter later. Now, the story really starts picking up about 5 years ago. That's when the dynamics in my family started shifting in ways I didn't notice at first because I wasn't looking for anything to be wrong. My dad had a minor health scare, his heart, nothing catastrophic, but it was enough of a wake-up call that my parents started quietly thinking about the future, about the house, about their finances, about what happened to things when they were gone. Very normal stuff, very appropriate for people in their early 70s to be thinking about. Linda, because she lived nearby and because she had always positioned herself as the family organizer, naturally stepped into a more involved role. She started going to my parents' doctor appointments with them. She helped them organize their paperwork. She was there 2-3 times a week. And at the time, I thought, good, I'm grateful. I can't be there every day. I'm glad Linda's picking up the slack. I told her so, too. I called her and I said, Linda, I just want you to know how much I appreciate you being there for them. It means a lot. And she said, of course, Carol, they're our parents. That's what family does. And it sounded so right, so warm, so exactly like the Linda I had always believed her to be. I even started sending money home, not huge amounts, but meaningful ones, a few $100s here and there, whenever I heard that something needed fixing around the house, or that Mom's prescription costs had gone up, or that Dad needed some new equipment for his health monitoring. It was never a burden for me. I wanted to help. I wanted to contribute. And honestly, it made me feel less guilty about not being able to be there in person as often as Linda was. That's something I need to be clear about, because it matters. I was sending money consistently for about 3 years. We're talking somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 over that time. All of it willingly, all of it out of love, all of it to help my parents. No strings attached, no expectation of being paid back. It was just what you do. Dennis lived even further away than I did. He'd relocated to the Pacific Northwest years ago with his wife, Christine, and Thomas, my youngest brother, had some personal struggles in his 20s and was still finding his footing. Neither of them were in a position to be physically present either, so it fell to Linda, and I supported that. I trusted it. The first tiny little thing that struck me as odd happened about 3.5 years ago, and I almost didn't register it as anything. I called my mom on a Sunday like usual, and I mentioned that I was planning to come home for Thanksgiving that year. I'd been alternating years with some of my own Fairview traditions, but I really wanted to be home that particular year. And my mom got quiet for just a second before she said, "Oh, well, I'll have to check with Linda about the plans." Have to check with Linda, not "Oh, wonderful, I can't wait," which is what she always said, not, "Of course, we'd love to have you." She said she'd have to check with Linda. I laughed it off in the moment. I figured maybe Linda had already started planning something and my mom didn't want to step on it. I figured it was nothing. I said, "Sure, just let me know," and we moved on. But looking back, that was the first tiny crack in the foundation. That was the first moment where something didn't quite line up with the picture I had always carried of my family. Thanksgiving that year was fine on the surface. There was food, there was noise, there were kids running around, there was football on the TV, but I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before. Or maybe I'd always noticed them and just never assigned them any weight. Linda was very much in charge, like noticeably, unmistakably in charge. She decided when we ate. She decided the seating. She decided when it was time to do the dishes and who should help. My mother, who had run that kitchen for 40 years, basically stepped aside and let Linda run the whole show, which, again, part of me appreciated. Mom's knees, Dad's energy levels, sure. But there were these little moments, little exchanges that felt a degree or two off. At one point, I offered to help clear the table, and Linda said, very pleasantly, very casually, "Oh, no, Carol, you just relax. You drove all this way." And it sounded nice. It sounded like she was being thoughtful. But there was something underneath it, like she was reminding everyone that I was a guest, that I didn't really live here, that helping wasn't my role. I also noticed that when Linda talked about my parents, when she talked about their doctor appointments, their finances, their plans, she said "we" a lot. We decided to switch Dad's cardiologist. We're looking at updating the will. We think it might be time to make some changes to the house. We. As if she and my parents were their own unit and the rest of us were just visitors to it. I mentioned it to Dennis on the phone a few weeks later, kind of casually, half laughing about it. I said something like, "Did it seem to you like Linda's really taken over the whole show?" And Dennis said, "She's always been like that. You know how she is." And I said, "Yeah, you're right," and I let it go. But I kept a little note of it in the back of my mind, a little file that I didn't think I'd ever need to open. The second thing happened about 6 months later. I called my dad one evening, a regular check-in call, and he seemed distant, not upset, just sort of vague and careful, like he was choosing his words. We talked about the garden, we talked about the weather, and then I mentioned that I'd been thinking about maybe looking into moving back to Millhaven at some point in the next few years. Not a firm plan, just a thought I'd been turning over. I'd been in Fairview for almost 15 years by then, and part of me was feeling that pull home, especially as my parents got older. And my dad said, "Well, Carol, I think that's something you'd want to talk to Linda about first." I paused. "Talk to Linda about?" "Just to make sure everyone's on the same page," he said. I didn't push it. I said, "Okay, sure," and we wrapped up the call. But I sat in my kitchen afterward feeling this weird, cold little confusion. Why would I need to run my own potential relocation plans by my sister? That wasn't a thing. That had never been a thing. My dad had never in his life suggested I clear anything through Linda. That was not a dynamic that existed in our family. Or I thought it hadn't existed. I was starting to wonder if maybe it had been quietly building while I wasn't watching closely enough. I called Linda a few days later, not about the moving thing, I wasn't going to bring that up, just a normal sibling check-in, and she was warm, she was chatty, she asked about my job and my friends, she seemed like normal Linda. And then she said, very naturally, like it was just information she was sharing, "I'm so glad I'm close by for Mom and Dad. They really lean on me, Carol. I don't know what they'd do without me here." I said, "They're lucky to have you." And I meant it. "It's not easy," she said. "It's actually really a lot, but I don't mind. Family first, right?" "Absolutely," I said. And that was it. That was a perfectly normal sounding conversation, but something about the way she said it, the timing of it, right after my dad had told me to run things through Linda, it started to feel less like gratitude and more like staking a claim. I tucked that little note away in the file in my brain, and I went back to my life. The 2 years happened about 2 years ago. My dad had a more serious health event, a second cardiac episode more significant than the first. He spent 4 days in the hospital, came home with a stack of new medications and new restrictions, and it was clear that the slow drift toward needing more care was picking up speed. My mom was struggling to cope emotionally. She'd never been good with medical stuff, never been good with fear, and Linda was there every single day. I drove home the weekend after Dad got out of the hospital. I stayed for 5 days. I helped around the house, I sat with my dad, I made sure Mom was eating, I went to the pharmacy, I organized their paperwork. It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like showing up. And Linda was gracious about it on the surface. She came over every day I was there. She included me in conversations about my dad's care plan. But there was this undercurrent, this barely there territorial thing that I hadn't felt before. Like she was watching me interact with my parents with this small, assessing look, like she was doing inventory on how much space I was taking up. One evening, when my mom and dad had gone to bed early, Linda and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea, and she said, "Carol, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll take it in the spirit it's intended." I said, "Sure." She said, "How long are you planning to be here?" I said, "5 days. I had already told her that. I had to get back to work." She nodded slowly. "It's just, Mom and Dad have a routine now, a real structure to their days, and when people come in and out, it can disrupt that. I've worked really hard to establish a sense of stability for them." I looked at her. I said, "Linda, I'm their daughter." She smiled. "Of course you are. I just want to make sure we're being thoughtful about their needs." I held her gaze for a second, and then I said, "I am being thoughtful about their needs. That's why I'm here." She backed off, changed the subject to something about Gary's work project. The moment passed, but I want to tell you that was the moment the file in my brain stopped being just a mental note and started being something I actually paid attention to. Because that question, "How long are you planning to be here?" was not a normal sister question. That was not a loving, caregiving question. That was a boundary question, and the boundary she was drawing was around my parents. I went back to Fairview, I called more often, I paid even more attention to the emotional tone of my conversations with my parents, and I started noticing something that I can only describe as a kind of managed distance. My parents were still warm, still loving, still happy to hear from me, but there was a careful quality to certain conversations, a sense that certain topics were being steered away from. Whenever I asked about finances, not nosily, just normal stuff, like whether they needed anything, whether they were comfortable, my mom would say, "Oh, Linda takes care of all that now. We don't have to worry about it." When I asked about the house, same thing. "Linda's been handling the maintenance stuff." When I asked about their estate planning, which my dad had mentioned he and Mom were finally updating, my mom said, "Linda's been helping us with our paperwork. We're in good hands." Linda was handling all of it. I want to be really careful here because I know how this sounds, and I know that on the surface it sounds like a devoted daughter stepping up to help aging parents. And for a long time, that was still the primary story I was telling myself. Linda had always been a little controlling, sure, but she also genuinely loved our parents. She was there. She was doing the work. I was 90 miles away sending checks. But the thing is, I'd been sending those checks for years, and I never once received so much as a mention from my parents that Linda was helping manage their money. They had always handled their own finances. My dad had always been meticulous about that. He'd been an organized man his whole life. The idea that he had just handed over all financial control to Linda without any conversation with the rest of his kids it just felt off. I mentioned to Dennis that Linda seemed to have taken over pretty completely, and this time Dennis's response was different. He got quieter. He said, "Yeah, I've been getting some weird vibes too. Christine asked Mom about whether they changed their will, and Mom kind of shut down the conversation." We both sat with that for a moment. "I'm sure it's fine," Dennis said finally, but he didn't sound sure. "Yeah," I said, but I didn't sound sure either. The first real, undeniable evidence that something was wrong came about 18 months ago, and it came from the most unexpected direction: my brother Thomas. Thomas, as I mentioned, had had some rough years: addiction issues in his late 20s, some financial instability, a period of real difficulty. But he'd been clean for 4 years by this point, working steadily, living in a small apartment about 30 miles from Millhaven. He and my parents had stayed in contact, though it wasn't as close as it had been before everything fell apart for him. He was rebuilding, slowly, carefully, and part of that rebuilding was reconnecting with the family. He called me one night out of nowhere. We didn't talk super frequently, maybe once a month, and he sounded strange, upset in a contained way. He said, "Carol, can I ask you something without it being weird?" I said, "Of course." "Have Mom and Dad said anything to you about me lately, like anything Linda might have told them about me?" I said, "No. Why?" He went quiet for a second. Then he said, "I went to see them last week, just a regular visit, and it was really different. Mom was kind of cold, Dad barely made eye contact, and then Linda showed up. I didn't even know she was going to be there, and she just kind of took over, started steering the conversation. At one point, she said something in front of me like, 'We just want to make sure everyone around Mom and Dad is a positive influence.'" I felt something shift in my chest. "She said that in front of you?" To my face, like I was a threat, like I was something they needed to be protected from. His voice cracked a little. "Carol, I've been sober for 4 years. I've been doing everything right. I just wanted to see my parents." I didn't know what to say. I told him I believed him. I told him it wasn't okay. I told him I'd look into it. And when I hung up the phone, I sat in my living room in the dark for a long time, because that was new. That wasn't just Linda being territorial about caregiving duties. That was Linda actively poisoning a relationship, using her position of proximity and trust to tell my parents, whether explicitly or through implication and suggestion, that their son, who had worked so hard to recover, was a danger to them. For what? For what purpose did that serve except to reduce the number of people with access to them? The file in my brain became a folder, and the folder started to get heavy. I started reaching out more. I called more, I visited more, I paid closer attention, and here's what I noticed over the next several months. My relationship with my parents felt filtered, like there was a layer between us that hadn't been there before. My mom said things sometimes that didn't quite sound like her: slight formal phrases, slight emotional distance in moments where I'd have expected warmth, like she'd been coached on how to handle me, which I know sounds like a paranoid thing to say about your own mother, I know that. But when you've called someone every Sunday for 15 years, you know how they talk, you know their rhythms, and her rhythms had changed. My dad was quieter than ever. When I visited, which I was doing more frequently now, every 6 weeks or so, he seemed almost relieved to spend time with me one-on-one. When Linda wasn't there, he'd relax. We'd sit in the garden and talk like we used to. But the moment Linda showed up, he'd get careful again, quiet, like a man who'd been told certain things were better left unsaid. I didn't push him. I didn't want to upset him, but I started having these long conversations on the drive home, 90 miles of highway going over every little thing, trying to figure out what was real and what was my imagination. And then my birthday came around. My birthday is October 15th. For as long as I can remember, my family made a thing of it. Not extravagantly, we were never an extravagant family, but meaningfully. My mom always baked me a lemon cake. We'd go out to dinner at this Italian place called Russo's that we'd been going to since I was in elementary school. It was a whole thing. It was my thing. Even after I moved to Fairview, whenever my birthday landed on a weekend or whenever I could get away, we'd do the Russo's dinner. This year, Linda organized a birthday dinner for me. She called me 3 weeks out, cheerful and warm, and said she was making reservations at Russo's, that the whole family was coming, that it was going to be wonderful. Mom and Dad, Linda and Gary, Dennis and Christine, who were flying in for the weekend, Thomas, and of course, me. I was genuinely moved. I thought, okay, maybe I've been reading too much into things. Maybe I've been letting worry get ahead of me. Look at this. My family is flying people in, making reservations, pulling everyone together for my birthday. This is what family looks like. I drove home on the Friday before my birthday feeling hopeful, feeling warm. I checked into a little bed and breakfast I liked near downtown New Haven. I usually stayed with my parents when I visited, but my dad was having a respiratory thing and I didn't want to crowd the house. I texted my mom that I'd arrived, she sent back a little heart, and I had a quiet evening reading and going to bed early. Saturday morning, I called my mom. She seemed a little distracted, a little hurried, said she had a lot to do before dinner. I said, I'll see you at Russo's at 6. She said, yes, see you then, sweetie. I spent the day walking around Millhaven. I got coffee at this little place near the old library. I walked by my old high school. I was in a genuinely good mood, that warm, nostalgic, I'm home kind of feeling that I always got when I came back. I bought a little gift for my nephew in a bookstore. I felt honestly like everything was going to be fine. I got to Russo's at 5 minutes to 6. I was wearing that dark green dress I loved. My hair was done. I felt good. The hostess led me to the private room in the back. Linda had reserved it, which was a nice touch. And I walked in to find everyone already there. Linda and Gary, Dennis and Christine, Thomas, my parents. They were all already seated, all already with their drinks, and the first thing I noticed, and this hit me with a weird jolt I didn't quite understand, was that there was no seat at the table for me. I stood in the doorway for just a second, looking at the table, looking at the faces turned toward me, and the faces were not what I expected. Not the birthday faces, not the, oh, here she is, it's Carol's birthday faces. They were serious, carefully neutral. Linda was sitting very straight, her hands folded on the table. Gary was looking at the menu like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. Dennis wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Thomas looked like he'd been crying recently. My mother looked at her lap. My father looked at me. And in his eyes, I don't have a better word for this, there was this terrible, helpless apology, like a man who knew what was about to happen and couldn't stop it. I said, "Hey, everyone. Sorry, am I late? I thought we said 6. Linda said, "No, Carol, you're not late. We asked you here at 6 on purpose. We wanted to be settled before you arrived." She paused. "We need to talk to you." And the floor fell out from under my birthday. Linda did most of the talking. She had clearly prepared. She spoke in this measured, carefully modulated voice, not unkind, not screaming, but firm, the kind of voice you use when you've decided something and you're informing someone, not discussing it. She said that the family had been having a lot of conversations over the past several months, that there were some long-standing patterns in my behavior that had been causing harm, that I was inconsistent, present when it was convenient for me, absent when it wasn't, that my financial contributions over the years had come with emotional strings attached, had made my parents feel obligated to me rather than cared for, that I had a habit of swooping in and disrupting the routines and stability that Linda had worked hard to establish. She said that my recent increased visits had been stressful for my parents, that they had told her privately, that they felt uncomfortable when I visited, that I asked too many questions about their finances, that I was creating anxiety. She said that the family had decided it would be better for everyone if I took some distance, some real distance, that they were asking me not to visit for a while, not to call as frequently, to allow my parents to have some peace. And then she said, and this is the part I will never forget, the part that is burned into me forever, she said, "We love you, Carol, but right now we don't want you here anymore." The table was quiet. I looked around at all of them. Gary, still not looking up. Christine, who I had known for 15 years, staring at the window. Dennis, who had called me 2 months ago saying he had weird vibes too, sitting there silent, not looking at me, his hands wrapped around his drink like he needed something to hold on to. Thomas was the only one I could read clearly. He looked shattered. He looked like he wanted to say something and couldn't. My mom had tears running quietly down her face, and she was looking at her hands. My dad was looking at me with that terrible apology in his eyes, and for just a moment, just barely, I thought I saw something else. I thought I saw a man trying to tell me something he couldn't say out loud. I stood in that doorway for what felt like a very long time, but was probably about 15 seconds. I felt like the world had tipped sideways. I felt cold. I don't know how to describe it actually. It wasn't just hurt. It was something deeper and stranger than hurt. It was the particular feeling of a ground you had always trusted vanishing beneath your feet. And then, because I am my father's daughter, and my father is a man who learned a long time ago that some battles aren't won by fighting in the moment, I took a breath. I said very quietly, "Okay." I picked up my purse. I said, "I hope you all enjoy dinner." I looked at my mother. I said, "I love you, Mom." I looked at my father, and something passed between us, something wordless and significant, and I held on to it. I said, "Love you, Dad," and I walked out of Russo's. I got to my car, sat down, closed the door, and I just breathed, in and out, in and out. The parking lot lights hummed. Somewhere, someone was laughing in the restaurant. It was my birthday. I sat there for probably 10 minutes, and then a calm came over me that was different from the cold of shock. This was something else, something that settled in my chest like a decision. I thought, "Okay, Linda, you want to play this? Let's play this." Here's the thing about being an accountant. You are trained, professionally, methodically trained, to follow paper trails, to look at numbers and see patterns, to notice when things don't add up. I had been doing this for 20 years. It was my literal job. And sitting in that parking lot outside Russo's on my birthday, I started thinking like an accountant. I drove back to the bed and breakfast. I ordered room service. I sat down with my laptop and a notebook, and I started making a list of everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I needed to find out. What I knew, Linda had effectively taken control of my parents' daily lives, financial management, and social contacts over the past 3 to 4 years. My parents had undergone a will update during that time. Thomas had been quietly pushed out. I had been characterized to my parents as harmful and intrusive. The family had been organized into a unified front against me at what was supposed to be my birthday dinner. What I suspected, this wasn't organic. This wasn't a natural family reconfiguration. This was managed, orchestrated. Someone had worked on everyone in that room to get them into those seats with those faces, and that someone had a reason. What I needed to find out, what had been done with my parents' finances and estate planning, whether my contributions over the years had been properly accounted for, what the actual legal status of my parents' affairs was. I didn't sleep much that night, but I was calm. That's the thing I want you to understand. Whatever grief was going to come, and it was coming, I knew that, there was going to be a full reckoning with the pain of that dinner. It wasn't going to come yet. First, I needed information. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Sunday morning, I made a decision that felt enormous in the moment and turned out to be the most important thing I did. I drove to my parents' house. I knew Linda wouldn't be there on Sunday mornings. She had a standing routine with her church group. I timed it carefully. I knocked on the door at 9:30, and my dad answered. He looked at me for a moment, and then he opened the door wider and said, "Come in, Carol." My mother was in the living room in her chair. She looked at me with such a complicated expression, guilt and relief and fear all mixed together. I sat down across from her. My dad sat on the arm of her chair. I said, "I'm not here to fight. I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to ask you both something, and I need you to be honest with me. Can you do that?" They both nodded. I said, "Is this what you want? Is this your decision?" My mother started crying before I even finished the sentence. My dad put his hand on her shoulder. And then my dad said, quietly, "Carol, I want you to know that we love you. Your mother and I love you very much. And there have been things happening that I don't fully understand and that I haven't been able to talk about." He paused. "Linda manages a lot for us now. She makes a lot of decisions, and I'm afraid your mother and I may have let that go further than we should have." My heart was hammering. I kept my voice steady. "What kinds of decisions, Dad?" He looked at my mother. She was crying quietly, not speaking. He looked back at me. He said, "The will, Carol. Linda was very involved in helping us update the will. She brought in the attorney. She was there for the meetings." I said, "Were you and Mom alone with the attorney at any point?" He thought about it. "For the signing, yes, but Linda was involved in shaping what went into it, in explaining our options to us." I said, "Dad, do you know what's in the will right now, what the current terms are?" He was quiet for a long moment. "It's been changed several times," he said slowly. "I know that the house situation is different now. I know that." I said, "How is it different?" Linda is listed as the primary beneficiary for the property, and she has power of attorney, both financial and medical." He said it like it cost him something to say it. "It happened gradually, Carol. It made sense each time she explained it. She was the one who was here." I took a breath. Steady, steady. "When did the power of attorney go through?" "About a year and a half ago." "And the will changes?" "Over the past 2 years, yes, in stages." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Dad, do you think any of what's in those documents reflects what you and Mom actually want? If it were just the two of you deciding, with no one else in the room, do you think those are the decisions you would have made?" My father looked at me for a long time, and then he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "No." My mom covered her face with her hands. I stayed for 2 hours. I didn't pressure them. I didn't overload them with questions. I listened. And what came out over those 2 hours, slowly, haltingly, with a lot of pauses and circling back, was something that made my stomach turn. Linda had spent years positioning herself, little by little. She told my parents that I only called to check on the inheritance. She told them that I resented not being closer to them, that I held grudges. She told them Thomas was still using, which was completely false. She told them that Dennis only came around for Christmas because Christine made him. She'd created this picture of a family full of people who didn't really care, who were only present when it was convenient, and positioned herself as the only one who truly, selflessly loved them. And she had done it so slowly, so consistently over so many years that my parents had absorbed it without fully realizing they were being shaped. They're in their 70s. They trusted their daughter. They had no reason to question the version of reality she was presenting because she was there every day and we weren't. She had also, I learned, been managing their bank accounts for the past year and a half. Along with the financial power of attorney, she had added herself as a joint account holder on their checking and savings accounts. She had taken over the paying of their bills. She had full access to everything. And the money I'd been sending for 3 years? I asked my dad if he'd received those transfers. He looked confused. He said, "I don't know exactly what account that went to. Linda handles all the account stuff." I kept my face very still. "Dad," I said quietly, "I've been sending money home for 3 years, regular transfers. It was for your prescriptions, house maintenance, whatever was needed. Are you aware of that?" He said, "I knew you'd been helping. Linda mentioned it a few times." "Did that money ever go toward those things?" He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know. I told them I loved them. I told them I would handle it. I told them not to worry and not to say anything to Linda about my visit. They agreed. My mom hugged me at the door for a long time. I drove back to my bed and breakfast. I checked out. I got on the highway toward Fairview, and for about the first hour of that drive, I let myself feel everything that I had been holding off since the parking lot of Russo's the night before. I cried is what I did. I cried pretty hard, actually. I cried for my parents and for how they'd been manipulated. I cried for Thomas being slandered as still using when he'd fought so hard. I cried for my own loss, for the dinners and holidays and calls that had been slowly poisoned over years without my knowing. I cried for my dad's face when he said he wouldn't have chosen those documents if it had just been him and Mom. And then, about an hour from Fairview, the crying stopped, and the accountant took over. The first thing I did when I got home was call a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I specifically found an elder law attorney in the county where my parents lived. Her name was Beverly Walsh, and she came highly recommended by a colleague of mine who dealt with a family estate situation a few years prior. I called Beverly's office first thing Monday morning and made an appointment for that Thursday. The second thing I did was open a document on my computer and start building a timeline. Every conversation I remembered, every odd comment, every financial transfer, every date of every visit and call over the past 3 years that I could reconstruct from my phone records and bank statements. I am an accountant. I know how to document. I knew exactly what I was doing. The third thing I did was call Thomas. He picked up, and I could tell from his voice that he'd been waiting for this call. I told him I'd been to see Mom and Dad. I told him I'd heard what happened with his visit and that I believed him completely. I told him I had some serious concerns and that I needed his help. He said, "Carol, I've been trying to tell someone about this for months. I didn't think anyone would listen." "I'm listening," I said. "Tell me everything." And he did. Over the course of a 2-hour call, Thomas told me about a conversation he'd had with his own therapist, who in very careful terms had observed that the dynamic he was describing with Linda and his parents sounded like it might have elements of what professionals call undue influence. Thomas, to his credit, had actually done some reading on this. He understood the pattern. He just hadn't had anyone else in the family willing to hear it. Undue influence, for those who don't know the term, is what happens when someone uses their position of trust or authority over a vulnerable person, elderly parents, for example, to manipulate that person into making financial or legal decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. It can invalidate documents like wills and powers of attorney if it can be demonstrated. It is in many jurisdictions a form of elder financial abuse. My hands were steady when I wrote that term down at the top of my notes document. Thomas also told me something I hadn't known. He said that Linda had, on 2 separate occasions, asked him to sign documents, vague, general-sounding things about family financial arrangements, and both times he'd refused because the documents made no sense to him. He hadn't told anyone about this because he figured he'd misunderstood what they were for, but now I told him to hold on to those incidents, to write them down with as much detail as he could remember, dates, what was said, where they were. I told him we might need it. Then I called Dennis. That was the harder call because Dennis had been in that room. Dennis had sat at that table and said nothing. I was hurt about that, and I wasn't going to pretend I wasn't. But I also knew I had to be strategic. I needed Dennis. His testimony, his perspective, his willingness to cooperate with what I was building, it mattered. He answered, and there was a long silence, and then he said, "Carol." I said, "Dennis." Another silence. Then, "I'm so sorry. I am so sorry about Saturday night. I should have said something. I sat there like a coward, and I'm ashamed of it." I let him have that for a second, and then I said, "Tell me what Linda told you before that dinner." And that's when I found out how the dinner had been arranged. Linda had called Dennis 3 weeks before. She told him that Mom and Dad were struggling and that the family needed to come together to address some difficult patterns. She told him that I had been causing problems, that I'd been interrogating my parents about the finances, making them feel like their decisions were wrong, stirring up trouble with Thomas, creating stress. She told him this had been going on for a while and that Mom and Dad had specifically asked her to help organize this family conversation because they didn't know how to bring it up themselves. She had framed it completely and skillfully as a loving family intervention on behalf of my aging parents. She had made Dennis and Christine feel like they were doing the right thing. She had done the same with Gary, not that Gary was ever going to push back, and she had somehow, over months of accumulated pressure and suggestion, brought my mother along. My dad, based on what I saw on Sunday, I believed had been less willing, but had gone along because he didn't want to cause conflict with Linda, who was, after all, managing everything. The dinner was not spontaneous. The dinner was engineered. It had been constructed over months, possibly over a year or more, with the specific purpose of isolating me from my parents, because I was the one who'd been asking questions. I was the one sending money, and therefore the one who might eventually want to know where it had gone. I was the accountant. I was the threat. Dennis was quiet for a long time after he told me all of this. Then he said, "Carol, what's really going on? What do you think she's done?" I told him what Dad had told me about the will, about the power of attorney, about the joint accounts, about the money I'd been sending. Dennis exhaled like I'd knocked the wind out of him. "I'm going to take care of this," I said, "but I need you to not tell Linda any of this. I need you to act completely normal with her until I tell you otherwise. Can you do that?" He said he could. He said he would do whatever I needed. He said he was going to call Thomas and apologize too. I said good. I said we'd talk soon. Thursday arrived, and I sat across from Beverly Walsh in her office. She was a small, precise, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had been doing elder law for 25 years. I laid out everything I had, my timeline, my documentation, my notes from the Sunday conversation with my parents, the bank records of my transfers, the information about the POA and will changes. Beverly listened without interrupting. She asked a few clarifying questions. She made notes. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and said, "This is a significant situation." She explained a few things to me. First, that the power of attorney, if obtained through undue influence or when my parents lacked sufficient capacity to fully understand what they were signing, could potentially be challenged in court. The more recent the changes, the better the chance that medical records and testimony could establish a pattern. Second, that a will prepared under undue influence is contestable. The fact that Linda controlled access to the attorney, that she brought in and managed the legal relationship, was a significant red flag. Third, that the financial power of attorney, combined with joint account access, potentially meant that Linda had had the ability to move or access my parents' funds freely for the past 18 months. She said the words financial elder abuse clearly and directly. She said we would need to act carefully and thoroughly. We would need my parents' cooperation. We would need their medical records to help establish their cognitive state during the key decision-making periods. We would need financial records, bank statements, transaction histories, which I would either need to obtain through my parents' direct authorization or, if necessary, through legal channels. And she said, the most important first step is a new estate attorney meeting with your parents, alone, without Linda, to assess their current wishes and whether the existing documents reflect those wishes. I asked her to make that happen. She made a call before I even left her office. She had a colleague, an estate attorney named Martin, who was also experienced in elder law, who could see my parents the following week. Beverly was going to personally contact my parents to set it up and to ensure Linda didn't know about the meeting. I walked out of Beverly Walsh's office on a fall afternoon in Fairview, sunlight on the parking lot, leaves orange and gold, and I felt something I can only describe as the sensation of moving in exactly the right direction. The meeting with Martin happened the following Thursday. Beverly had reached my parents. She'd called during the morning, knowing Linda's schedule, and explained that she was an attorney who worked with families and that some family members had reached out with concerns about ensuring that my parents' legal affairs truly reflected their wishes, and that she wanted to arrange for an independent review. My parents agreed immediately. My mother later told me that when Beverly said independent review, she started crying on the phone. Martin met with my parents alone for 2 hours. No Linda, no family, just them and him. What came out of that meeting was the confirmation of everything I had feared and then some. My parents were completely cognitively intact, sharp. They knew exactly what their documents said. They also knew, when asked in a private setting with no family present, that those documents did not reflect their actual wishes. My mother said that she had felt pushed along through the signing processes, that Linda had been so certain, so confident, so clearly in charge, that it had felt impossible to push back. My father said there were moments when he'd wanted to ask more questions, but that Linda was always there, managing the meeting and managing the attorney and managing the flow of conversation. Martin also, in the course of the meeting, reviewed the will carefully with them for the first time since signing, and my mother was visibly shaken by certain provisions. There were things in that will she said she didn't fully understand she'd agreed to, specifically around the property. The house, the home my parents had lived in for 40 years, had paid off, had planned to leave equally to their 4 children, was structured in a way that would give Linda full control of the property for a period of 10 years, with the other 3 children receiving a payout calculated on an appraised value from 3 years ago, not current market value, 3-year-old appraisal value, in a market where property values in Millhaven had gone up significantly. In other words, Linda would get the house effectively, and the rest of us would get a check calculated on a number that was potentially $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 below the actual current value. My father, when Martin walked him through this, said very quietly, "That's not what I thought I was agreeing to." Martin documented everything. Beverly reviewed his notes and confirmed that there was substantial basis for a challenge. Meanwhile, I had been working on the financial side. With my parents' direct authorization, they signed a simple written consent. I obtained access to their bank records for the past 2 years. I sat down with those records the way I sit down with any audit. It took me about 4 hours to work through it, and what I found made me set down my coffee cup and sit very still for a moment. In the 18 months since Linda had been added to the accounts as a joint holder, there were transfers totaling approximately $43,000 that did not correspond to any identifiable household expense, not utilities, not medical bills, not any of the things Linda theoretically had been paying on my parents' behalf. $43,000 that had moved from my parents' accounts to, initially, a general account, and then, traceable only through a series of careful transfers, to accounts I didn't have direct access to, which appeared, based on account names, to be in accounts in Gary's name, Gary's construction business. I stared at those numbers for a long time. I also cross-referenced the periods of those transfers with the timing of my own contributions to my parents, the $15,000 to $20,000 I'd sent over 3 years. The timing correlated in a way that was very difficult to explain as coincidence. Money would come in from me, and within a few weeks, sometimes days, similar amounts would move out to those other accounts. My parents had never seen that money, or rather they'd seen it arrive, but they'd never had the chance to allocate it because by the time they might think to do anything with it, it was already gone. I printed it all out. I organized it into a clear, documented report, the kind I would have prepared for a client, clean, factual, annotated, thorough. I brought it to Beverly. She looked at it for about 20 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up at me and said, "Carol, I want you to understand what you have here. I said I understood. This isn't just a will dispute. This is potentially criminal. This is financial elder abuse. The amounts involved, the mechanism, the documented transfers, this is something we need to put in front of law enforcement. I said I know. She said, this is going to be very difficult for your family. I said I know that too. Beverly filed the challenge to the power of attorney and will within 3 weeks of my parents' meeting with Martin. The legal basis was undue influence, breach of fiduciary duty, and potential lack of informed consent during the signing periods. My parents were co-petitioners. They signed willingly, completely, with full understanding. At the same time, Beverly helped us prepare a report to the Adult Protective Service unit in my parents' county. This is the agency that investigates elder financial abuse. I submitted my financial analysis along with the bank records and my documentation of the transaction patterns. I also quietly, and with Beverly's guidance, reached out to the state bar to inquire about the attorney who had prepared my parents' documents, the one that Linda had brought in, not because I was sure he'd done anything wrong, but because Beverly wanted a full picture of how those meetings had been conducted and whether there were any ethics concerns worth flagging. Linda did not know any of this was happening. She continued to call my parents. She continued to come by the house. My parents, incredibly, maintained their composure through all of it. They were calm. They were pleasant with Linda. They gave her absolutely nothing to work with. I told them once, "You don't have to do this. I don't want to put you through more stress." My father said, "Carol, we want to fix this. We should have fixed this a long time ago. We are going to see this through." My dad. My quiet, garden-tending, careful father. I thought about all those Sunday calls, all those drives home, all those years I trusted this foundation, and I thought, he's still here. The foundation is still here. It was just being obscured. 3 weeks after the legal filings, Linda was formally notified of the challenge. I know she received the documents because she called my mother approximately 45 minutes after service was attempted, and I happened to be sitting in my parents' living room when the call came in. I could hear Linda's voice from across the room, even though Mom had the phone to her ear. She was not screaming. Linda would never scream. That was not her style. She was doing that precise, controlled, very fast talking that she did when she was actually panicking underneath a smooth surface. My mother listened for a moment and then said quietly, "I have to go, Linda," and hung up. We sat in the silence for a moment. Then my mother said, "She sounds very upset." My father from across the room said, "Good." Linda called Dennis. Linda called Thomas. Neither of them told her anything useful. Dennis, to his enormous credit, told Linda that he supported the process and that he thought it was important for everyone's sake that things be properly reviewed. Thomas didn't answer her calls for a week. Linda showed up at my parents' house 2 days after notification. Beverly had advised us on this possibility. She'd told my parents that they were under no obligation to discuss the legal proceedings with Linda, and that if they felt uncomfortable, they should simply say they'd been advised not to discuss it and end the conversation. My father answered the door, told Linda exactly that, and closed it. Linda stood on the porch for a few minutes. My mother watched from the window. Then Linda got in her car and left. The APS investigation was opened within 2 weeks of our report. They assigned a caseworker who came to interview my parents. They also requested the bank records, which, because we had already compiled them, were provided quickly and clearly. The caseworker, a woman named Dana, was thorough and professional. She told my parents that the pattern we had documented was consistent with what they saw in financial exploitation cases. The legal proceedings around the will and POA moved faster than I expected. Because my parents were active participants, because they were cognitively sound and clearly expressing their wishes, the court's primary concern was protecting them going forward. The financial power of attorney was suspended pending review within the first month. This meant that Linda's access to my parents' accounts was frozen. She was removed from the joint accounts by court order. Gary's business records were subpoenaed as part of the financial investigation. That's when things got very serious very fast, because Gary, it turned out, had taken that $43,000 and used it to cover cash flow problems in his business practices. There were records, there are always records, and when the investigators looked at his business financials alongside my parents' account history, the picture was clear and damning. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not sloppy bookkeeping. Money had been deliberately transferred from two elderly people's retirement accounts into a business account to cover operating expenses, and based on the timing and the method, it was clear that both Gary and Linda knew what they were doing. Criminal referrals were made. I won't go through every legal step because, frankly, we are still talking about it months later, but here is what I can tell you happened. Gary was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. This is a felony in our state. His business, which was already in trouble, which it turned out was part of why they needed the money, collapsed under the scrutiny of the investigation. His licenses were suspended, 2 of his active contracts pulled out. He and Linda had to sell their house to meet legal costs. Linda was charged with 1 count of financial exploitation and 1 count of undue influence in a fiduciary capacity. She cooperated with investigators in exchange for a plea arrangement that reduced the criminal charges, but the plea still carried real consequences. She received a 3-year supervised probation, mandatory repayment of the full amount taken, permanent removal as any kind of financial or legal representative for my parents, and a permanent court record. The will was formally invalidated. My parents' estate was restructured by my parents, with Martin and Beverly, with no outside pressure as it should have been from the start. The house, in the new documents, is to be divided equally among all 4 children. There are appropriate independent trustee arrangements in place. Linda is excluded from any role in their estate. And the $43,000, it is being repaid, slowly in structured installments because Gary's business is gone and they don't have it all at once, but it is being repaid, every cent, with interest as ordered by the court. As for the money I sent, my $15,000 to $20,000 over 3 years, my parents insisted on repaying me personally. I told them absolutely not. I told them that money was a gift from love and it stays that way. My father cried a little when I said that. I had never seen my father cry before in my whole life. It's been about 8 months since the birthday dinner, since I walked out of Russo's in my green dress on my birthday. 8 months since I sat in my car in that parking lot and made a quiet decision. My relationship with my parents I don't have a word for what it is now. It's not the same as it was before all of this. It's deeper somehow, more honest. The layer that had been between us for years is gone, and what's under it is something real and clear and safe. I go home every 3 weeks now. I stay with them. I sit in the garden with my dad. I bake with my mom, badly, because I never learned to bake the way she did, but she's patient with me. My dad told me recently, on one of those garden afternoons, "I never stopped knowing you, Carol. I just let someone tell me a story about you that wasn't true, and I'm ashamed that I let that go on as long as I did." I told him there was nothing to be ashamed of. I meant it. Thomas is in a beautiful place. He has started joining us for Sunday dinners when he's in town. He and my dad have rebuilt something between them that I honestly didn't know was possible. The slandering Linda did, the lies about him still using, those came out in the legal process and they were documented. There's something almost purifying about having the lies put on record, about having a court acknowledge what was done to him. Dennis and Christine have come back to Millhaven twice since everything happened. Dennis and I are closer now than we've been since we were kids. There's a lot of guilt on his end still. I can see it sometimes. But guilt, in this case, has made him more present, more intentional. He calls more. He doesn't wait for Linda to organize things. He shows up on his own terms, for his own reasons, because he wants to be there. Linda, I want to be honest about Linda because this is complicated. She is still my sister. She is still the person who taught me how to do my hair and snuck me wine at Christmas and who I once loved without question or reservation. Part of me will always love that version of her. I don't think I'll ever fully stop being sad about what she became, or maybe about what she always was underneath, the part I never wanted to see. I have not spoken to Linda since before the legal proceedings began. I don't know if I ever will. That's not a dramatic statement. It's just the truth of where things are. She lost her home, her husband is facing criminal charges, her family relationships are shattered, she is suffering real consequences. And while I cannot find it in myself to be glad that any human being suffers, I also cannot pretend that those consequences are anything other than exactly what she earned through deliberate, sustained, calculated cruelty. What she did to our parents, she did slowly and on purpose. What she did to Thomas, she did on purpose. What she tried to do to me, the isolation, the birthday dinner ambush, the managed campaign to cut me out, was calculated and intentional. She looked at our aging parents and she saw an opportunity, and she took it. That's the hard, simple truth of it. Gary, I have nothing complicated to say about. He is a man who took money from elderly people to save his failing business, and he is facing the consequences of that. There's one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'll be done. About a month after all the legal proceedings got underway, I got a card in the mail, handwritten on plain white stationery. It said, "Carol, I have not been a good sister. I do not expect forgiveness. I want you to know that Mom and Dad were always proud of you. I made sure you didn't know that. I'm sorry. Linda." I read it twice. I sat with it for a while, and then I put it in a drawer. I don't know what Linda was feeling when she wrote that. I don't know if it was genuine remorse or a last attempt at some kind of leverage. I don't know, and I probably never will. What I do know is that I am not in a place, maybe not ever, where that card can open any door between us. Some things, once broken, stay broken, and that's not a tragedy if the breaking was earned. My last birthday was in October, a year after the birthday dinner at Russo's. My parents were there, and Dennis and Christine, and Thomas with his girlfriend, who is wonderful. We went to Russo's. I wore the same green dress. We sat in a booth, not the private room, just a regular booth, and we ordered pasta, and we talked about nothing important, and the kids drew on the paper tablecloths with crayons, and my mom brought a lemon cake she'd made that morning, and the staff brought it out with a candle, and everyone sang, and it was the most ordinary, unremarkable birthday dinner you could imagine. My dad put his hand over mine at the table and didn't say anything. He just left it there. And that, if you want to know the truth, was the only justice I ever really needed. The end.